Hello and welcome back to another Construct 3 3D tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to discuss one of the things that I had mentioned in the previous video. And I mentioned in the beginning of it that there would probably be some changes to how 3D works in Construct 3 coming very soon. And I was right. So before we get started, if you are not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Hit that thumbs up for me also. YouTube's algorithm likes to pay attention to stuff like that, and I always appreciate any kind of support. Construct 3 introduced a very important change to how 3D works, and that change is the Z-axis scale. Okay, so what is Z-axis scale? Well, if you were joined with me in the first video when we have an object like let's take the wall for example. The wall has an X and Y value in pixels, a width of 10 pixels and a height of 1112, which this is our 1112 on the Y-axis, and then 10 across from left to right on the x-axis. Then in the properties, if we scroll down, we have a z height of 40, which gives us the 3D depth look. But this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us when we deal with 2D dimensions like x and y, but we're not talking about pixels in z height. Instead, z height is referring to units. And as the creators of the Construct 3 engine mentioned in a recent video, that the scale for a unit in perspective of the 3D camera object is somewhere around 5.8 pixels per unit. Now that creates some weird situations of having to do math to try to get it just right. Whenever you go into the game, everything looks kind of squished or stretched, unless you have the Z height units adjusted to match X and Y scale in pixels. But they have made changes. So if we go over to the input folder that we created in that last video, we have a 3D camera object. And if we click on it, it brings up the properties and we see the Z scale is that 5.8. And the default camera Z is 100 units high. It's 100 times 5.8 basically. So we can actually change this to where the Z scale is 1 and it's done in pixels instead of units. And to do that, we need to come up here to the very top folder in our project panel. And that's going to be, I named my project 3D_tutorial. And you know, if we close this, it closes everything else in it. That means everything in our project is inside this folder. So if we click on this top folder and come over to the properties and scroll down under display, we have an option that says Z-axis scale. And by default, it is set to normalized. And normalized uses the Z units. And if we click the drop down, we get normalized or regular. Select regular, you see immediately the camera zooms itself out. If we click back on our 3D camera object, now our Z scale is set to 1. Remember, it was 5.8 earlier, and the default camera Z was 100, but now it is that 579.4, which translates into that 5.8 in pixels. So now we are dealing with a Z height and Z elevation in pixels instead of units. But that does some weird things. I'll play, and this is our game exactly how we set it up. Now our walls are very short. Our jump is, it seems pretty normal, but it looks like we are just racing through this level. I don't really think we're going that much faster. We might be, but everything is squished and nothing looks like it's supposed to. So we're going to have to make some changes if we want to switch our project over to this format. And moving forward, all of my 3D tutorials are going to use this Z-axis scale regular instead of normalized. So if you are starting a new 3D project in Construct 3, make sure this is one of the first things you set. That way, everything you create will be by this Z-axis scale. However, if you already have a project going and you want to change some things over to Z height and Z elevation to read in pixels instead of units, then we're going to have to make a few changes. So one of the things that we noticed is that our images, I'm zooming into this wall here, our images are stretched or squashed on our 3D shape. I'll play and go in, and you see our bricks just don't look good at all. So if we click on the base of this wall, that selects the wall object, you can see it highlighted there, and then scroll down in the properties. And a couple of things. One, we have our Z height is still set to 40 because that was 40 units, but now it's just reading 40 pixels. That's why our walls are so much lower. But the thing I want to look at right now is the Z tiling factor. We talked about this a little bit in the first video, but now it actually comes into play. And the way this is set up is a factor of 8 in reference to the Z height being done in units. But now we're in pixels. Our tiling factor can just be 1. So now it looks normal. It's not squished or stretched, but it does look like it's zoomed in or, really big. Our bricks got a lot bigger, but they actually didn't. What's happening is, I'm sure you've noticed, our player's view is like we're crawling on the ground. We're very close to the ground, and our walls aren't very tall at all. Our walls are only 40 pixels tall now, where before they were 40 units, which would be that 40 times 579.4, as we saw in the camera's properties. So I'm going to exit out of that. And with this wall object still selected, I'm going to scroll down in the properties, and I'm going to change that Z height. I found that 230 was pretty close to our 40 units. And it doesn't really matter in this case because we used a tile object to display the image on the side of this wall shape. So if we go back and play, now we have a very tall wall, and it's really not any taller than it was in the last version because our player's view is hugging the ground. So let's exit out of that, and let's go change that part. So over in the event sheet under our camera, we have on start of layout, and then again in our every tick, we tell the camera what height to be in. And in this one, we can see that our camera Z is whatever our cam 3D elevation is, plus the cam height variable. And our cam height variable is set to 15. Well, before that was 15 units. Now it's 15 pixels. So we're very close to the ground. The good thing about us creating this variable in that first video is that this number is used here and in a couple other places. So we don't have to change or go look for any of those. We can just come to our cam height and double click to go in it and change. And I found that 85 was a good height for my liking. So now we tower above all these tiny little blocks, and our wall doesn't look as tall anymore. It's still tall enough to be a wall, but it's not towering over. So still some things to do, but it doesn't look like our player is moving as fast as it did before. And that's because we're just a little further off the ground. Okay, let's exit out of that. And I'm going to close the camera group up. And let's go back over to the layout. And I want to get all of our walls to be this size. So I am going to close every group up except for the walls. And I'm going to draw a selection box over all of them. And then I'm going to scroll down to the Z height, and it says multiple because we changed this one but not these, but I want them all to be the same Z height, so I'm just going to click in there and type in 230. And now a couple things happen. One, our walls change their height, and our beams that were also wall objects on the wall layer changed to 230 as well. So another thing you can see is we have our what looks like a normal brick pattern on this wall, but it still looks like it's pretty stretched over on this side. And I just unselected everything by accident, so I'm going to zoom out and reselect everything again, all our wall objects. And I'm going to scroll down in the properties, and our Z tiling factor is multiple as well. And that's because our beams have a Z tile factor as of 1. We set that up in the first video. But these others still have a Z tile factor of 8. So I'm going to click in there, and I want them all to be a Z tiling factor of 1. So now, when we play, everything looks the way that it should. Okay, another thing I want to point out is that the tops of these platforms don't look skewed at all. And that's because they are on X and Y values and not Z value. whereas the sides of the platform are still squished because their tiling factor for the Z height is still set at 8. So let's exit out, and I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to unlock our platforms layer, and let's go over to this top platform that we created in that last video. And if we click on it, we actually have two objects here, and the top one is the 3D ground, which on its X and Y value, 160 by 160, there is no tiling factor for X and Y. But if we scroll down, the tiling factor is set to 8. Now we just used the top of this ground object, so we don't really get to see its sides. But if you were ever to want to use sides for your ground object, you would want to make sure that you change that Z tiling factor to 1. Now, since this object is on top of the 3D platform object, we need to get to that 3D platform object underneath it. And like we learned in the first video, if we hold down Tab and click, it takes us to the 3D platform object. So now we have control of these orange sides, the orange bricks, or gold, I think it's called. So I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to change its tiling factor to 1. And then if we play, now we can see that it looks normal. But the Z height has not been changed. Now that it's pixels, it needs a little more height. So with that 3D platform object still selected, I'm going to scroll down to the Z height, and I'm going to change that 8 to 45. And really, I'm just multiplying everything by 5 to give us something similar to where we were before. I'm not going to multiply it by the 5.8, although I could have rounded it up and gone with multiply by 6, but multiply by 5 is a lot easier math to do. So I'm going to go with a Z height of 45. So now the walls of our platform stick up way higher than our ground. Well, we can just click in this area, and it'll click that top object, which is our 3D ground. And I want to move its Z elevation, because remember, it doesn't have walls. It's just the top ground object, so that we can jump up onto it. I'm going to change that Z elevation to 45. We do have a little bit of an issue. I'm going to play. And if you see, there's actually a gap between the ground object and the platform object. That's because we gave it, the ground object, a Z height of 1. So the bottom of the ground object, even though it's transparent, is flush with the top of the wall. I don't know why we set it up like that, so I'm going to change that to a 0. And now we've closed that gap off. Okay, and we can still, well, if we could jump high enough, we could still jump up onto it. But we'll deal with that here in a minute. I'm going to exit out of this, and I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to just delete these other platforms that we created in the last project. We don't really need them. If you need more platforms, you can just select these two, control click, drag out a copy, and make more platforms, and then adjust their Z height from there. Okay, let's go work on that jump strength, because we were not jumping very high at all. So in the event sheet, let's go into our Z elevation group, and I'm going to scroll down here a little bit so we can see what's happening in our jump code. And this is actually pretty easy to fix. Since we're dealing with pixels instead of units, we weren't jumping very high at all. So we can just double click into this variable that we've already set up and change this. I'm going to just go to 2. And then if we play, now we have something a little bit weirder going on, but we can jump up over that platform now. But I think it's 1, I think it's a little too high, just a little bit. And we also float. So exit out of that. The way we fix the floating part and the height of the jump is we can play around with the gravity. So if I bump this up from 3 to a 4.5, now we don't jump as high. And this is a little bit better. This is probably a lot closer to what we had in our first video. But I still think it floats a little too much. And this may be what you like, and it's a good example of how to set something up like that. But I'm going to play around with this a little bit more. I did some messing around, and I'm actually going to go with a jump strength of 3.8. And I'll show you what that does without changing gravity. We jump a lot higher, and we still kind of float, but not as much. Since we upped the jump strength, we need to up the gravity as well. And I'm going to bump this from 4.5 to 12. And if we play, now we still jump high enough to get up here, but we fall much faster. So just to give you an idea of how that works, it actually works very similar to how the platform behavior works in a 2D side scroller. If you change the jump strength and then up the gravity quite a bit, you can affect how fast your character jumps and falls. All right, not too bad. We're going to come back to this Z elevation group here in a minute, but first let's go back over to the layout. And we changed our Z tiling factor for our walls and our platforms, but we didn't change it for our ground object. And I'll show you this hex ground. The top of it, unaffected because it's X and Y coordinates, but its Z coordinate on the side here is all stretched out still. And the same with our stairs because we used ground objects for our stairs. So let's exit out of that. And I'm going to lock everything except for the ground layer. I'm going to unlock that. Then I'll zoom out and I'm going to draw a big square over our level here. And this has selected both grounds and our stair objects, which are all 3D ground objects. And I'm going to scroll down to Z tiling factor and you see it says 8. So that means all of what is selected on screen still has a Z tile factor of 8. So let's change that 8 to a 1. And you notice it didn't affect the top of our objects because those are still X and Y. If we play, now you can see the side of this hex ground looks just like our walls. Okay, I'm going to click out of that in a blank space to unselect everything. And I'm going to zoom in as much as I can on this first step here. If we select that, we have an elevation of 0. So it's flush with the top of our ground here. And Z height of 1. Remember, I was trying to make everything a multiple of 5 now. So I'm just going to take that 1 times 5 and bump it up to 5. So let's go ahead and preview this. And you can see that first step is a lot taller than those others that are squished. So this mimics pretty much the size that we had in our last project. I'll exit out of that. So if we change the Z height of our stairs, then we need to change the Z height of our ground as well. So I'm going to click on this left one and I'm going to scroll down and give it a Z height of, well, 5 times 2 will make it 10. If I play this, we fall into nothingness. And the reason is because if you notice over here, my player layer, although locked, is still visible and there's no player. But if I hide the ground layer, you can see our player. That's because the ground layer is higher in Z height than our player. Our player object is at 0 Z height, and our ground is now 10 pixels high with an elevation of -2, which means it's 8 pixels taller than where our player is. So I'm going to say -10 for the elevation, and there's our player. And if I play, now we don't fall through the floor into the void. Okay, let's finish up on our stairs. So we changed our first one. Now let's change the rest of these. In fact, I am going to box select the rest of these very carefully as to only select those stairs. And then we can come down here to the properties and change the Z height for all of them at once. So I'm going to change them all to 5. So if this one is sitting at a Z elevation of 0 and it has a Z height of 5, then I want this next one to be at an elevation of 5 to meet the top of that first stair. So that means if this is 0, this is 5, and we keep adding. So our third one is going to be 15. The fourth one will be 20. Next will be 25, 30, 35, and then our last little platform here at the top of the steps will change to 40. And then if we play, we can see that I messed up somewhere. Okay, let's go fix that. Which one was that? That is 0, 5, 15. So 10, then this one will go down to 15. Boy, I messed that up, didn't I? This one will go down to 20. Now we're just subtracting 5. 25, 30, and then our last platform will be 35. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so now our hex floor or ground needs to be even with this last platform. So if we click on our hex ground and we scroll down, our Z height is still set at 8 and Z elevation is at 0. So I'm going to keep it at 0 so that we can see the sides of that ground object. And since our last stair object is a Z elevation of 35, I'm going to make the hex ground Z height 35. And then if we play, now it's even with that top stair, and we have some of that blue rock wall. Looks like we have another issue that I did not catch with our top step there. So I'll click on it and see what's going on. That's because our Z height is 1 and it needs to be 5, just like the rest of them. So that should fix that. It does. And now that we change that step, it looks like our hex ground needs to go back up 5 more. So I will click on that and come down here and change that to 40. There we go. Now we're all even on the stairs. Okay. We've changed all of our squishing and squashing and stretching issues with the images. We've got all our Z height and Z elevations fixed. Now that we've changed over to pixels instead of units, now we can start building new levels without having to change all this stuff moving forward. However, we're not done yet, because if I try to go up these stairs, I fall into the void. And there's a good reason for that. If we go over to the event sheet in our collision with ground group here, in our first check, we check for the Z elevation of the ground and compare if it's greater or equal to the player's Z elevation minus its own height. And then we do it again to see if it's less than player's Z elevation minus its own height. And then we add 5 for that cushion. And that cushion allows us to check to see if we are actually just slightly below the next elevation of the solid ground object. And what's happening is I just changed all of these steps to a Z height of 5. So we're checking to see if it's less than this equation, and it's not. But if we give it just a little bit more cushion, it'll tell our player to shift up in Z height. So instead of plus 5, I'm just going to say plus 5.5. So I'm only adding half of a pixel because this is no longer referring to units in Z elevation. So half a pixel difference. If we hit done and then we play, now when I go over the stairs, it works just fine. In fact, we can just stare at them and go down sideways, and we see that we are tweening up and down the stairs. So a pretty easy and very quick fix for all of this. I hope most of this has made sense. I wanted to make sure that I covered it in good enough detail that you understood what was happening and try to explain the difference between our Z scale axis. And to recap on that, if you remember, when we go to our 3D camera object, we can see that our Z scale is 1, which is what we want. The default camera Z is just something that the game engine is going to mathematically process itself. And to change this, we go to our project folder, our overall project folder, and scroll down to Z axis scale. And regular is what gives us our Z height and Z elevation in pixel form instead of units. And if for some weird reason you want to use the units, then you would pick normalized. And if I pick normalized, we go into the layout, you can see that our stairs are super steep because we increase the value of everything. And I'll play, and we are really tall. And this is an interesting look, but not really what I want. And the stairs still work too, so that's kind of neat. I hadn't really played around with it in reverse that way. So I will go ahead and change this back to regular. And you see our camera zooms back out. Everything takes on a new size because it's in pixels now. And if we play, everything looks the way that I intended it to look when creating this project. Okay, that is how Z-axis scale works in Construct 3 3D. Pretty important change coming from the folks over at Construct 3, but it's a good change, and this is the unit of measurement for Z-axis scale that I will be using in all my 3D projects moving forward. All right, hope you enjoyed the video. If you found it helpful, please leave a thumbs up for me. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do that as well. I always appreciate the support, and I certainly appreciate you taking time to watch this video. That's going to do it for me this round. Tons of more content coming your way very soon. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.